Sure.
Oh, and even before that, this controversy. Well, let me start with what William Rubenstein said on the blurb of your Jacob and Esau, which he said, the author deserves a medal for bravery in writing the book. Could you elaborate what we're talking about there, please?
Well, it's a big issue. I mean, it's not easily summarized. I mean, I could talk for hours on that topic. I'll just say it's generally a field that is very emotional, the obvious. Now, there are plenty of others that are that way, the Russian Revolution, the First World War, Nazism and so on. But I think the one's particularly. And I think there are a number of kind of sacred cows that, not that no one has ever touched them before. And by the way, my claims to originality are minimal. I think I put a lot of things together, but I'm not saying things that no one ever said before, for the most part. William Rubenstein actually contacted me after reading the book and said something to that effect. I never met him before. And he's also, well, he's done some courageous things. Do you know him at all in his work?
No. He's British, isn't he?
He's British, although he's American, really. He was born in the United States and taught in Australia for a while. Now he's in Wales. I've never met him myself, but we've exchanged many emails. Anyway, he wrote a book, for instance, on the bombing of Auschwitz, which is a terribly controversial matter, and got his share of wrath, I guess is the word. Yeah. So I think that he wrote that in part because he knew if you say certain things, you will get a number of people very, very angry at you.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that then, please. I mean, because in large part I have quotes from your book, which again, I don't expect you to remember the nuances.
Sure, but
hopefully it'll just be a springboard.
It should probably. Yeah.
But one thing you said, there was a controversy about your book, let me get this here, by some in the Jewish community particularly, and there was some. You wrote a rebuttal in the American Historical Review. I got this online just to sort of start, and you said this: a number of prominent observers have recently remarked that as anti-Semitism steadily declines in the United States, a small but vocal minority of Jews paradoxically trumpet its existence everywhere. And I've run into that issue a lot. Could you elaborate on that from your perspective?
Well, I think the offending agency most of all is the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. Most people feel that they overdo it, that they're whipping, particularly in the United States. Now they're whipping a dead horse, so to speak. I'm not sure I'd go so far as that. I mean, obviously anti-Semitism is alive in the United States, and I can attest to that. I've encountered it myself in some fairly nasty forms. It's still here, but it's very much marginalized. Now in the rest of the world, I mean especially in the Arab world and Islamic world, it has taken on a new kind of life, and that's the so-called new anti-Semitism. And many of these people who make a lot of anti-Semitism are talking more about that than they are about it in the United States. Mm-hmm. Now that said, there's also a development. Again, I don't want to give you a whole lecture on this. There's so much on the left, that is, especially the radical left or the extreme left, mostly out of anti-imperialist motives, I would say, attacking Israel. And the attacks often do, not surprisingly, overlap with what was previously considered anti-Semitism. So that's part of it, I say. I think it's a big topic, and again, in there, I'd say could be argued endlessly. I think for Jews to simply say it's no longer important in the United States, and many are, by the way, perhaps most are, but that's like losing a leg, you know. It's part of their identity. In the book you haven't read yet, I make that, I devote a paragraph to imagine for a moment Jews who were no longer hated, who no longer felt that was part of their identity. Now it's such a deeply, I mean, from the Exodus narratives for the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, Jews have identified themselves as people who are hated. So the adjustment to saying, well, we're really not hated. Maybe some people don't like us that much, but it's normal. It's like everybody else. That's it's a big step. Now, by the way, I think a lot of young Jews, especially the kind I encounter at the university, are there. That's what they're saying, you know. We are not hated. We can say what we like. We can feel comfortable. We're more comfortable here in the United States than we would be in Israel. Many are saying that quite openly now. And of course, the migration out of Israel far exceeds migration into Israel from the United States. So in a way, the United States is the more desirable place to go. Now that's a big statement as well.
Are you Jewish, may I ask?
No.
What is that like in this field? I mean, I think you mentioned this someplace. Actually, I quoted that there are very few, at least in recent times, non-Jewish writers,
Yeah.
and it's perilous in some degree. I mean, could you discuss
It is, although I have not emphasized that much myself. The last book I actually edited with Oxford was with a Jewish colleague, so to speak, somebody I've worked with for many years. When I started this whole field, in my own interest, moving from, I was on the left, so studying communism and so on, it was at the initiative of a Jewish colleague who said, let's teach this together. We could do some interesting things. And certainly among my most loyal supporters, let's say, have been large numbers of Jews. So I'm not going to make that complaint particularly. I think the obvious point that a non-Jew will see things differently than a Jew. That doesn't mean that there's some sort of wall of miscommunication that is always there, but that was partly what I was, when I got into it and saw some of the many problems, I came more and more to think, well, Jews certainly are very penetrating observers of non-Jewish society, but there aren't many non-Jews who are penetrating observers of Jewish society. Now, those are not parallel things. Jews are a tiny minority. They have not had power, and so it's not as if you're comparing it exactly, but to direct myself again directly to your question, I have been welcomed more than scolded, so to speak. And the scolding has come mostly from extreme right-wing neocons, not from my students, certainly, or my own colleagues. I have scores of colleagues who are Jewish, and really by now thousands of students I've never once seen on a student evaluation. And this is something, because student evaluations are pretty wild. You get any suggestion that I was saying something anti-Semitic. Now students misinterpret everything, so to me that's almost unreal. But I mean, my point is, it's not as if I feel it's a terribly hostile environment. It is hostile. A certain part of the Jewish community can make you very uncomfortable, but I don't think that's the biggest reality.
Just one more point on this, because again, I've interviewed Norman Finkelstein, Mearsheimer, and other one, and all of them have been accused of being self-hating or anti-Semitic and all that. And you have also. I mean, and the paradox being,
they don't know. They assume I have to be Jewish. That's right.
Well, could you elaborate on the issue of intimidation? What's going on with that? I mean, it seems like, you know, because this is not something just for you. I've seen it in different realms.
Well, as you know, Finkelstein is very combative, and he raises hackles that he probably doesn't need to by his style. But I think he says some very interesting things at the same time. I think another thing that I'm a little different on, I don't quite get so outraged as some people about things that seem anti-Semitic. I just say, all right, let's look at it. I've talked to many of these, not Finkelstein, by the way, but others who are on the dirty list, so to speak. And for the most part, I found them quite, what's the word, rational people to talk to. I don't necessarily agree with them. Finkelstein I would not say that about. He's very, very passionate. And he raises hackles and says things, of course. It's not just style. He has some real content.
Has there been any consequence or cost to you for writing this book? And I ask that because I know with both Mearsheimer and Watt, for example, there has been. And they're both tenured professors, but they feel that they have been very much blocked.
You know, even mentioning things I might think, I'm not a paranoiac. I really am not. And I can just give you an example of things without reaching extreme conclusions. This debate that you followed a bit in the American Historical Review, Now, I could tell you that's a long story, but and I was attacked constantly, letter after letter, which is not supposed to happen in the American Historical Review. You're supposed to get one person saying another, and that's it. But their friends did it, and their friends did it, and you know, okay, I had a chance to defend myself. But since then, I've never been asked to review a book from the American Historical Review. Now, I've been asked regularly for years, for 20, 30 years before. And so, even though I think I won the debate, I didn't in that sense. Now, not writing for the Historical Review is not my end all in life. You know, I can live without it. I mean, there are other things like that. I wouldn't want to make a big case of it. It may just be accident. I can't prove anything, and I don't even feel that particularly disturbed by it. But I think that's the kind of thing that, you know, in the Jewish community in the past, somebody who does something wrong, they don't kill him. They don't, you know, it's not like the mafia, but they do put him into a kind of category of shunning. And I think there is that. I've experienced it a bit, but I don't want to make a big issue of it. Partly because I couldn't prove it, and at my age, you know, if you're paranoid, you see enemies everywhere,
Right.
and even when they're not enemies. So.
I mean, when I first read your book, I mean, it struck me as a kind of heresy. I mean, in terms of everything else I've seen, and you know, in terms of the kind of, and I wonder if you could address that, which is to say, there are all kinds of entrenched narratives especially from the Jewish community, about categorical innocence in terms of anti-Semitism and blameless and all. You discuss that at length, and I have a lot of these quotes. Could you, in general overview, discuss
What the heresy is?
Yeah, what's your heresy? What is your crime?
I'm not always sure myself, I have to say. But I think I've even seen it called the Lindemann thesis, that Jews are responsible for anti-Semitism. Now, that's not what I say, but I do say to consider Jews as entirely blameless, as if they had nothing whatsoever to do with it. And then I associate, again, my name is associated with the so-called rise of the Jews, that modern anti-Semitism, and many, many examples of anti-Semitism in the past, correspond to a perception of, and often a reality, of Jews rising in power and position and so on. Now, that's, to me, so overwhelmingly obvious in modern times that, you know, I'm not saying anything particularly original, but some people think, well, you're blaming the Jews for rising, which I don't. You know, an explanation is not the same thing as a guilt trip. If somebody is disliked because they're really a great athlete, you don't blame them for that dislike. It's envy, conceivably, or who knows what. So I think, insofar as I can make out some of these criticisms, it clearly makes some people mad. And I could give you plenty of examples of that, people I knew who got very mad when they read the book. And that seems to be because one of the things that you dare not do is blame the victim. Now, I call that one of the kind of empty set phrases. Blame the victim. What does that mean? The Germans are victims in the First World War. We blame them for Nazism afterwards. Until you can distinguish, how do you make a victim? What is it? Are victims always innocent? Well, they're not always innocent. In fact, you go to the prisons and look at people and they've done horrendous crimes. They're often themselves victims of something before. You could say generally. So that, you know, I just think it's a very simplistic thing. I think many people will get angry about the book, haven't read it, especially ESAU'S Tears, which is a fairly challenging, it's a big book. And then that kind of gets a whispering, Lindemann says that the Jews are responsible for anti-Semitism and so on, and that's the heresy as I understand it. Now, there have been so many authors before who have associated, let's say, the rise of too many Jewish doctors, too many Jewish journalists, and so on. They say, well, that's why there's anti-Semitism. I'm not saying much more than that, but maybe putting it in a broader context and over a longer historical period.
May I adjust the microphone? I'm sure it's fine, but just to make sure that... Let's see. Okay. All right, thank you. Let's see. This is from the Anti-Semitism Before the Holocaust. I just jotted down a few things. So I want to get these out of the way. You say this, very interesting. Tons of you say a lot of interesting things. A belief in the lasting hostility of non-Jews or the other nations, Goyim in Hebrew, can be described as a key tenet of Jewish religious and cultural traditions, predominantly seen in the narrative associated with such holidays as Passover, Hanukkah, or Purim. I interviewed Samuel Haleman, who's an expert on Orthodox Judaism. This subject came up. But could you give me your take on that? The issue, I guess, the question I sort of have is, to what degree do all these classical Jewish religious traditions, where's the angle on anti-Semitism in it?
Well, that's a big topic again. You'd have to look at which ones you're talking about. Exodus, for instance. Let's just talk about that for a minute. If you read the text, the basic text, that is Exodus and the end of Genesis, you could easily make a case that the Jews provoked a righteous indignation from the Pharaoh. Because, what does he say? The Jews are growing. They started out 400 years before as a group of maybe 100. Now, according to the Bible, they're 2 million. Now, 2 million is a pretty big figure. And I think total population of Egypt probably wasn't more than 10 or 15 million. And Jewish tradition itself says, we do not accept Egyptian religion. In fact, everything about us is the opposite. Right now, if the Pharaoh said, there are these people here who are growing very, very fast. Everything we try to do to control them doesn't work. And they actually don't accept our gods. And they may well cooperate with our enemies. Then let us put some controls on them. All right. That's one anti-Semitic narrative that you can draw from the text itself. Now, stepping from the text a bit, you can also say, well, what the Pharaoh, and people have said, what the Pharaoh was doing is getting rid of these people because they had a disease. They had, the disease is variously described, but get them out of here. These are illegal aliens. They're coming into our country, like California. The same kind of things people say about the Mexicans. They bring disease and crime and everything. We want to get them out. Now, I'm not I know it's associated with that. I just want to say that if you want to take the basic narrative and pull it in a different direction, it's right there. Now, Purim, you could do the same thing with that. I mean, if you want to go on that, I could give you each holiday, Hanukkah. There is an obvious anti-Semitic narrative that you can derive from the basic text, and has been derived. And people would say, many people will say, oh, Jews have been brought up on this text to believe that they're unfairly hated. If you look at the text, it's not so clear they're unfairly hated in the text itself. Now, commentary can do anything with the text. In Purim, Haman, supposedly, here he is, he's the vizier, the chief honcho of the Persian emperor, and Mordecai refuses to bow down before him. Well, in the ancient world, that would be the death penalty. Now, why does Haman hate him? Well, because he did this stuff. And why does Haman want to get rid of the Jews? He says the Jews don't follow our laws. Well, the Jews probably didn't follow their laws. Of course, this is a fictional narrative anyway, but Jews theoretically don't follow the laws of the people around them. Now, what are the laws? Which laws are you talking about? None of that is explained in the basic text. So that's what I think that's what you're getting at.
Well, you follow that sense up, but you talk about the underlying message in the Jewish community is that we have always been hated, and you frame that in quotes. And you also add, you say that may be understood as a mirror image of the anti-Semitic belief that Jews always hate other people and religions. And so within that, I was talking to my friend about the kind of material I've been getting in my project, and she raised the question, and I want to ask you, Ed, which is to say, in this game of hating, and I'm finding stuff on the Jewish side. Obviously, as you well know, there's a lot of hate coming from the Jewish community towards Christians, and which came first?
By the way, that is a real question. Although, when you go back 2,000 years to figure who threw the rock first, so to speak, it really is irrelevant. I think there's no doubt that it came from the Jewish community first, in that the Christians were a dissident group, not accepted and they're not, and never have been accepted. Now, when Christians were a powerless minority, that's one thing. When Christians become the powerful majority, it's another thing. You see, my point is that who knows what really happened between the Jews and the Christians, by the way. That the texts are various. It's not even clear which man they're referring to when they talk about Christ in the beginning. But clearly, and some of the Jewish texts take pride in the fact that they killed this dissident. They stoned him rather than, or maybe hung him in a different way. It wasn't the crucifixion necessarily of the Romans, but that they wanted him dead. And there's all kinds of evidence, again, many books have come out, about rituals of the Jews throughout the ages celebrating the death of Christ. Now, modern Jews have very much suppressed that and say we don't believe that, and I don't think they do. But you just go back and you say, who started it? That is, by the way, I don't think it really is a very interesting question, because who started the antipathy between French and Germans? Well, they had contrary interests, and you can always find something that one of them did, and so on. When you have peoples who are very different from one another, who actually threw the rock first probably doesn't make a lot of difference. The Arab-Israeli conflict, you say, who started it? Well, obviously the Israelis. They came in and took over all the lands of these people and drove them out of their land. Why wouldn't they be hated?
Well, the reason I ask this is, like one Jewish professor I just spoke with, Mr. Dinnerstein, he did a book on anti-Semitism. Yeah. And in my interview, he was giving me, very frankly, he's talking about all the defamatory terms for non-Jews. Goyim is defamatory, and shiksa and all these things.
Shegets.
All this stuff. And his defense of it, in essence, his position is, well, it was a response to Christian anti-Semitism. Yeah. And that's why it's like, it's endemic from the kind of, for the most part, people talk, could you elaborate on this thing? There seems to be, it's an excuse for their own bigotry or something. Not everybody, but...
I think it's, as I say, it's not really interesting in a deeper sense. Because it's a little bit like when you go, if you're a parent and you try to find which kid started it, Have you have children?
No.
Well, I can tell you never find out who actually started it, because they're at each other all the time, and who pulled whose hair and so on. I think until you begin to look at deeper issues. But unquestionably, there is a language of abuse in the Jewish community. Unquestionably, it reflects hostility to mistreatment by those around them. Unquestionably, it goes way back. And as I say, that who actually threw the first stone, we don't have evidence to be absolutely clear, but clearly the Christians came out of the Jewish community and at first were very much disliked and hounded and condemned by the Jewish community. So you could say, in that sense, the Jews started. I wouldn't want to get into that argument, by the way, because I think, as I said many times, it does make a lot of sense.
Okay, you say this too, and you say, one sometimes hears the complaint that Jews are, I type, oh my God, are excessive about the subject, anti-Semitism. Some are dogmatic and bullying in discussions of it, while others use it in a manipulative way in relation to non-Jews. Should you elaborate on that?
Well, if you, a non-Jew, most non-Jews don't know a lot about Judaism, or let's say about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And to be termed immediately you're ignorant, which many non-Jews are, of course, or that there's something corrupt about your perception of the world, most non-Jews simply become quiet. They're intimidated. Moreover, they really don't want to hurt these, they're usually Jewish friends or people they like, and these discussions are not really on the basis of equality. And undoubtedly, Jews will, not all, and not even most, but many will use those kinds of intimidating adjectives to really get away from a clear description. I say that in part because I experienced that myself. And so many things I was told in argument as a teenager, let's say, with Jewish friends, I just stopped, I didn't know that. But it was not right. It was not true. I mean, the Arab-Israeli case would be a good example, but I remember once I was corrected very stringently by saying that Jews were more than a religion. Well, I mean, that's ridiculous. Of course they're more than a religion. I got this from I remember an older woman, mother of one of my friends, We are a religious group, that's all. There's nothing about us that's except the religious group. Well, most Jews don't accept that today. So to say there is undoubtedly an unequal exchange, interestingly, because Jews are 1 or 2% of the population in the United States. But of course, they're talking about something they know a great deal about. The other 98% doesn't usually know that much. And a lot of the people think they know something are just as ignorant. I mean, clearly are ignorant about it. But there's an intimidated stance. Now, that's changing. And I think a lot of the leftists that I referred to a while ago are indeed very well informed about Jewish religion, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and so on. And many Jews themselves, of course, have come out to be very critical, let's say, of the first stages of the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the ADL's stance on this, that, or the other thing. So it's gotten to be much more of a equal argument or discussion. And that's troubling to many Jews.
You brought up the issue a number of times, and this is fascinating. There's so many fascinating things in your book. You brought up the issue of the racial component, or you had in quotes, of Jewish identity.
Yeah.
And the lineage, I know the mother and all that. Now, in my experience, I mean, there are very few Jews who are going to go there. There's peoplehood, there's ethnicity.
They don't use the word race, you mean?
Yeah, they're not. It's like that's like a kind of taboo. But I mean, you touch on it carefully. But could you elaborate on what are I forget how you phrased it also. But it's ancestral and whatever. But could you elaborate on the issue?
Well,
of race?
there are lots of ways of looking at it. First of all, I think you have to recognize the word race is a mishmash. It can mean almost anything. Even at the time in the 19th century, when it first emerged as, quote, science, it wasn't. I mean, it was kind of contradictory, and the people putting forth weren't really scientists in any real sense, by our modern sense. So it already was meant many, many things. Even Hitler uses race. He's talking about spiritual race. Well, that's a contradiction in terms. So, all right, the problem is the word itself. I worked on an article years ago, I never published it, but it just traced the words that are like race in every language that I knew, Russian, French, Italian, and so on. And they all kind of go over this. You could make an interesting map. There's something there that we might call it like inherited traits or genotypes, to use our own scientific word. Each language catches it a bit. Folk in German, for instance, people, and so on. But to get to the bottom line, I would say all of them have a certain mysticism to them. Even people, the Jewish people, what the hell is that finally? It's not that easy. You think you could define it, and believe me, when you press it, it gets ever more elusive. And how you become a Jewish person, or how you enter into the Jewish peoplehood. In principle, you can do that by religious conversion. But almost everybody will recognize. Somebody who formally converts will not be recognized by a lot of other Jews as really Jewish, doesn't have the Jewish sense of humor, or all these other things that are cultural inheritance. So,
may I shut the door?
Yes, I was afraid
I'm talking about Jewish.
So anyway, and by the way, some Orthodox, especially ultra-Orthodox, will say, yeah, there's a racial component of because you can just define that as we believe that we're descended from a certain group of people. I mean, really, literally, we're descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob a long time ago. And they're, now they're finding there are in fact certain kind of genotypes, certain kinds of DNA evidence of a Jewish line, and not exclusive and nothing like what the Nazis were talking about. But it's not as if the people we call Jews today could not be recognized from people we call Swedes today by looking at their DNA. They are different. By the way, all of this, I'll give you one of my least appreciated points, and I cannot get my students to even understand it. When you talk about race, you're really talking about something almost like religion. And what we're really getting at when we say people are equal is a religious concept as well. We mean equal, really, when we think about not, obviously men and women are not equal, even though we talk about equality. They're not the same. We're talking about spiritual equality, the equality of the human soul, if you want to use that word. There's something, there's metaphysical, not measurable with physically. And that is mystical, that's not science. If we want, our own country is based upon human equality. Blacks, whites, women, gays, they're all in principle to be equal. Now, what does that mean? In one sense, it's easy because the law can define what equality means. Of course, we fight about just where you draw the line. Do gays have the same right to, equality under the law as others and so on? But when you're talking about something deeper, the human dignity, for instance, you don't make a slave of a man or a woman because that's something you don't, it's immoral. Again, that's a concept. You can't measure that. You think these people are equal to one another. But that doesn't mean that there aren't really groups you can identify. To say that blacks and whites are equal in a way is stupid. It can't be. Of course they're not. One has a white skin, the other has black. Or really one has a brown skin, the other has pink, whatever. That men and women are equal. What in the world does that mean? Of course they're not equal. They're not the same. But if you're talking about their spiritual quality, their souls or their human worth, their human dignity, that's the basis of equality. And of course, extreme racism tends to deny that. But peoplehood, all these other concepts, seems to me also come down to be not something you can really measure. They have to do with values and metaphysical in the sense of being beyond the physical. Something you recognize. Culture, by the way, isn't a way that way. It's very hard to measure.
May I ask you, you're hitting on something and I want to sound you out. I interviewed Norton Mesvinsky. Do you know who he is?
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And he talked at length about Chabad, Lubavitchers.
Yeah.
And you touched on something about, you just said something about extreme racism having to do with the soul. Now, he has read all the texts of Rabbi Menachem Schneerson. He discussed to me on tape about how Schneerson, Chabad, and that realm of Jewishness, maybe to the past, there is a special soul that are Jews, and then there's another kind of soul that is not, like a lesser tier. And is that racism?
Yeah, I think it is. It's a peculiar kind of racism. It's not modern, it's not 19th century European racism. But if you go back to what I'm saying, what does race mean? If you're saying that there are one group of people who are essentially, in a very essential sense, different and better than another group, which Schneerson and others clearly say, that's racism in our normal understanding. Now, they don't use the word race in the same way, and I say it's not exactly the same. It's not coming out of the laboratories of anthropologists and so on, but it definitely says there's something about a Jewish neshama, soul, that is superior, morally especially, but they even play with the idea of intellectual superiority and so on. Now, by the way, I would say 90% of Jews today don't believe that. And Schneerson doesn't speak for even the ultra-Orthodox. He speaks for one branch of it. But it's there.
Well, this is what I still going back into history, though, before the Enlightenment, most Jews would subscribe to that kind of, right?
Well, do we know? We don't really know. It seemed, yes. I mean, in a way, you can say Schneerson is thinking in 16th, 17th century, or even earlier, pre-modern terms. And what ordinary Jews believed, by the way, is very hard to know. It's hard to know what ordinary Christians believe. I've always thought most ordinary Christians, especially Catholics, don't know the catechism. They don't understand the Trinity, and some things are pretty hard to understand. But in other words, if you are going to say you have to believe all these things to be a Christian, it doesn't work, because a lot of people don't. If you take polls now on Christians, what they believe, I mean, it's almost nothing. There's hardly any distinction between them and secularists. And they say they believe in God, but you can't push it very far. So I think the same thing about knowing what Jews all believed. But I think your point is still, at that time, there was no modern, enlightened, rationalistic criticism of that to speak of. It was just beginning. And most Jews that was kind of in the norm of what they believed. And by the way, most people at that time, the Jews would be strange if they believed that we're all the same. most people tended to believe in a kind of proto-racism, that we Poles are different and we French or whatever, they saw their, looked different, they had different language, they had different customs and so on, and they tend to think that was not just cultural, but something coming from within. Modern racism really is kind of a dressing that up again, giving it a little bit more respectability and a more rational basis, but not much more.
May I ask, along these lines, one more point. Are you familiar with the story of Postville, Iowa? Postville, Iowa.
Oh, sure.
Okay. I interviewed Professor Stephen Bloom, who wrote the book, and he was a fantastic interview.
Bloom? No, Friedman.
No, the guy who wrote a book called Postville, The Clash of Cultures.
Oh, I know the book. I thought his name was
Stephen Bloom. No, it's Stephen Bloom.
Okay.
University of Iowa. But the interesting thing about, I'd like to sum you up. It seems from his perspective even, and he was very frank and very condemning of
his book is really quite an indictment of it.
But in your view, could one look at that as in some sense a kind of microcosm of history? The idea of those individuals in town and all the tensions that are there, and there's a lot of the kind of...
It is, it's very tempting to say that. And by the way, most of these Postville rabbis are corrupt to their core. Or not most, I don't know. Many of them have been caught subsequently in various kinds of mistreatment of their workers and financial misdealings and so on. They're not a particularly estimable group, at least on the leadership level. The rest of them I don't know that much about. And were they like that? The Jews like that in history? I'm inclined to doubt it. It's too diverse. The Jews are too diverse. And I don't think even the place they came from, that is Eastern Europe, that was the predominant way that Jews operated. If Jews were that bad, so to speak, they wouldn't have survived. People didn't, that's another one of my theses, that certainly people thought in kind of generic terms. But Jews were seen by a lot of the population as two things. One, likable. That's but probably far more important, useful. They did things, they knew things, and so on. And I don't think that they were all like these rabbis. I think they were probably a rather diverse group. Some not all that intellectual, some not all that Jewish. And so on. So I wouldn't want to carry that very far. It's tempting. When you read Postville, you think, well, all right. Especially if you're coming from my position, the Jews actually do things that make people dislike them. I don't really say that's not my position. It's not just that.